Number 10. Will Carrol. Will Carrol, the drummer of the band Death Angel, caught COVID-19 at the end of his band's European tour. It was a long, hard battle, and thankfully, Carrol was able to come back from it, but the battle along the way may have included an encounter with Satan himself. The virus put him in a critical state, which involved Carrol lying unconscious in his hospital bed for 12 days straight. In an interview with San Francisco Chronicle, though, Will revealed that those 12 days were spent in a peaceful dream state. In his dreams, or I would call them nightmares, the devil would punish him repeatedly for the sin of sloth. The devil would apparently turn him into a bulbous-like creature and make him puke blood until his heart gave out. These were the dreams he was having over and over again. Since recovering from the disease, needless to say, Carrol has changed his lifestyle habits. For more reason than this one, it appears recovering from this awful virus we all hate definitely felt like returning from hell. Maybe the virus is from there too. Wouldn't be surprised, to be honest. Number 9. Giuseppe Tartini. Everybody wants to be the best at something, but for Tartini, the best just wasn't good enough. Tartini was born on April 8th, 1692, and the guy might as well have been born with a violin in his hand. He was brilliant, a brilliant musician and composer, and he thought so too, until one day he heard someone playing the instrument he dedicated his life to with a kind of expertise that he had never heard. This sent him spiraling, and for 12 days, Tartini locked himself away, practicing all hours of the day. While he drove himself mad, the devil decided to pay a visit to a desperate soul in a dream. He offered to make Tartini the most masterful violinist in the world in exchange for his soul. Like the wise guy he was, he asked for a demonstration, so the devil picked up the instrument and played a sonata with ease and beauty like nothing he'd ever heard before. When Giuseppe awoke, he scrambled to write down the sonata, which has become easily one of his most popular pieces of work. Its name? The Devil's Trill, and I listened to it and it is beautiful. For his entire career though, Tartini remained frustrated with the piece, as he was never able to play it exactly as he had heard it. This story is a reminder to never make a deal with the devil, as you never really get what you asked for. Number 8. Rose la Tulipe. It appears that the devil and the violin kind of go hand in hand. The story of Rose la Tulipe is a famous French-Canadian story and one of my absolute favorites. The woman who shared this story with me swears it was true, and I can't help but believe it either. Rose begged her father to host a dance on the eve of Lent, and he agreed, but with one condition: that at midnight the dancing had to stop. Dancing wasn't allowed during Lent, so if they continued, they would be sinning. Rose agreed, and everyone came to join on the night, and Rose danced with anyone who would, even with other men, though she was engaged. Then at 11 p.m. a knock came at the door, and the priest opened it to reveal a dazzlingly handsome stranger, and Rose fell hard. The priest welcomed him and requested that he take off his hat, shoes, and jacket, all of which the man refused, saying he wasn't staying long. He immediately swept Rose in a dance and asked no one else for the remainder of the evening. As soon as midnight hit, the dancing stopped, but the man whispered in her ear, "Just one last dance, my Rose." With struggles she resisted, but suddenly her feet, bewitched it seemed, began dancing without her. The man then kissed her, and the spark from their kiss set the house ablaze. The next morning Rose was found mumbling around the ashes, now mysteriously an old woman, the devil having taken part of her soul with him. I know, that sounds like a legend, but like, thanks for indulging me because I really love that story and I want an opportunity to tell it, so here it is. Other versions say that she actually got taken back to hell with him, and another is that her mother came and saved her. A whole bunch of stuff, but I think that one's my favorite. Okay, number 7. Richard Cable. Richard Cable might as well have been the devil himself. A squire at Brooke Manor in Devon, England in the 1600s, he was known as a monstrously cruel man. He abused his wife, and one night she escaped him with him hot on her heels. He killed her and her faithful dog, but little did the man know that that dog would haunt him for the rest of his days, and there would be many. At least that's what Cable thought. Cable had made a deal with the devil to live forever, but mysteriously, Cable passed away in 1677. But it appears the devil did give him everlasting life, as a spirit walking the moors at night, forever being chased by a herd of hounds. The locals even put iron bars around his tomb because there were so many sightings of him wandering around the moors. Instead, now, a red glow occasionally emits from his resting place, and the howls of demons are said to gather, waiting to claim his soul for their master. Number 6. Saint Dunstan. Saint Dunstan was a saint who lived in 900s, and for some reason the devil loved to visit him. He was a talented metalsmith, and one day an old man requested that he make a chalice for him. Dunstan agreed, but when he looked back up at the old man, he had shifted into a woman and then very suddenly a boy. Immediately he knew it was the devil, but fearing his wrath, concealed his distress and crafted the chalice. Subtly though, he put his blacksmith tongs in the fire, and quick as he could he thrust the tongs onto Satan's nose and cast him from the cell. That wouldn't be the last time he saw the devil though. Dunstan would face him once again and attack the devil by hammering into his hoof, and only agreed to remove it if the devil agreed never to cross a threshold where a horseshoe hung. And that's why today horseshoes are considered good luck, so take a lesson from that. Number 5, a boy named Scott. An article written by Richard J. Bonifant recounts several near-death experiences in order to try and see similarities. Some usually describe a light or a tunnel, but after a little boy named Scott got into an accident, he may have met something much darker. On June 10th, 1995, Scott and his family were enjoying getting ice cream from the ice cream truck, as you do, but Scott was so excited he ran out from behind the truck and he got hit by another motorist. He was almost declared dead, but 8 hours later, thankfully, he awoke in intensive care. The weirdest part was that he described in perfect detail what had happened to him as if he was watching from across the street. He knew every single detail. It was really freaky. Even recalled trying to give his dad a hug, but passing right through him. The scariest thing though was who he ended up meeting. He suddenly faced a dark vortex and felt himself being drawn into it by the haunting, putrid image of the devil. Scott said he looked like a man made of rotting flesh, and he tried to grab Scott, but he was whisked away into a tunnel of light, so it was kind of like the devil's trying to steal him from God. I'm glad things ended well for the little boy, getting to be with his family again, but still, not something anyone wants to see in the afterlife. Number 4, Dr. Paul Thigpen.
All of a sudden I felt as if the darkness had filled my whole body and that there was maybe a little part of it that was still me.
That was a clip of an interview with Dr. Paul Thigpen, who despite being raised under a Christian household became an atheist before he was even 12 years old. That is until one day he was hanging with his friends when he was around 17 by the water in the front seat of a car. All 3 of them were squished in, and a palpable darkness began pressing into the top of his head all the way to the bottom of his toes. He said it took over the majority of his body, and though he'd become an atheist, he didn't drink or do drugs, so we know this isn't a psychedelic experience, but his body suddenly felt like a kind of superhuman strength taking over him. A voice in his head whispered, "I'm throwing you into the water." To this day, Dr. Paul can't swim, and his body started moving across his friend's seat to leave the car. He knew he was going to die. Then he heard another voice that said focus on the cross. He suddenly remembered the cross his girlfriend gave him, so he grabbed it, and meanwhile his friends were like freaking out. After holding the cross for a while, he said the darkness subsided, and when he told his friend what had happened, he said, "That's strange. The same thing happened to my girlfriend." He sought counsel from another friend who without a doubt said that he'd been visited by the devil. Later he discovered that his girlfriend's friend was a witch, and that kind of pointed all the arrows in that direction, so who knows. Was it a demon or in fact the devil? Either way, something changed his mind. Watch the rest of the interview and decide for yourself. Number 3, the man with the glowing eyes. Reddit user Dabby_U_69 had an experience as a kid that I don't think anyone could be the same after. They grew up in a pagan household, which apparently meant you saw a lot of weird stuff. But one day, on a Tuesday in the afternoon, she was playing with the daughter of a family friend who they called Jay, just outside as you do. So they're just playing, and then all of a sudden Jay just stops dead in her tracks and points behind her. She froze and then turned around slowly to see, and I quote, "a tall shadow man about 6-7 feet tall in a trench coat and hat. The scariest thing about him was his eyes. Oh God, his eyes. Huge, red, and glowing circles, but its actual eyes were small, bloodshot, and his pupils were tiny. The man reportedly tried to strangle them, but they bolted too quick for the house. Once they told their moms, they in turn freaked out because apparently at the same time the man appeared, the TV had turned long static. They brought in a psychic who said, 'My love, the devil is here and he wants to hurt you. He was sent by someone, but we don't know who.' The woman then gave a crystal bottle filled with sage and lavender along with something else to ward him off, and apparently the bottle is running out. So I hope she's okay." Number 2, Father Gabriel Amorth. Father Gabriel Amorth was the official exorcist for the Diocese of Rome and claimed to have performed 60,000 exorcisms before he died in 2016. But one day in 1997 he encountered a spirit he never thought he'd see. A slim young peasant man was escorted to a small room where Father Amorth waited him. Immediately he knew something was wrong. He requested the help of Jesus, and as soon as he did, the man began to spit and curse in English, which wasn't a language the man was known to speak. But then the man was seething with anger and drool drip from his mouth as he stared down the father. He tried to attack him, but the exorcist held him back with prayers, demanding the demon reveal its name. He called out, "Unclean spirit, whoever you are and all your companions who possess this servant of God, I command you, tell me your name, the day and the hour of your damnation." The man snarled, and what came out next paralyzed him. Dripping evil, the man said, "I am Lucifer." He continued fighting the devil with prayer, and the windows formed ice crystals as he did so. The man also bent backwards for 25 minutes, howling at him, then began hovering at 3 feet in the air. Was it him? We don't know! We just don't know, but it certainly sounds like it. Number 1, last but not least, we kind of have to talk about this because I think a bunch of people saw the devil here. Castle Houska is one of the creepiest places in the world, as it was specifically built to keep the devil inside. Legend says that the castle was built over a gateway to hell. From afar, it looks like a typical old castle until you get closer. The castle wasn't built to be lived in, as evident by the fake windows and doors. Though there's a way inside, people don't recommend you step foot in there. In 878 AD, winged beasts and half-human creatures spilled from the gateway and terrorized the people in the village. Somehow they held them off long enough to build the place, but they were still curious. When construction first began, prisoners in the village would be offered a pardon if they agreed to be lowered by rope into the hole. The first man to attempt it is said to have met the devil himself while he was down there. He was tied up and slowly lowered. After a few moments in the darkness, the man began screaming and begged to be pulled up. By the time they hauled him up, he looked as though he aged 30 years. His hair was white, his skin creased and speckled. They tried to discover what he had seen, but the man was incoherent and was later put into an insane asylum before dying 2 days later.
Starting us off with number 10 is The Hand. This was from Stephen Wagner, who said his dad told him the story. So back in 1942 in Juarez, Mexico, his dad was around 20 years old and he went to a circus that was visiting town. His younger brother came along and they didn't really go to see the acts, they were more interested in the freak shows. Disappointed after seeing the performers, they were about to leave with 2 girls when they ran into a short, stubby man. The stranger introduced himself as the greatest illusionist in the world. That's quite a hefty title. When asked if he was part of the circus, the man said the owner turned him down because his act was so frightening. The owner said he was Satan himself. Once he had their attention, he invited them back to his trailer in order to show them the act. Once inside, the stranger put a glove on his right hand, started running his left hand over his right while wiggling his fingers. He then started chanting bizarre words, and when he took the glove off, everyone's jaws just dropped. The stranger's hand was completely skeletal. He turned it, let them see the back, it was completely real. His brother went to take a closer look, and the man grabbed his head and said he was really about to show them something now, and at this point everybody shat themselves and made a run for it. The stranger came out onto his porch laughing, and on the floor nearby was a bed of long nails pointing up, which he jumped onto. Weird flex, but okay. Blood started coming out of his feet, but he was still just laughing it off, and from that day onwards, Stephen's father and brother knew they had met Satan. At number 8 we have A Better Life. This one's from Redditor Kodas_gaming, who said he had a really rough upbringing. His father abandoned his family and his mother was a heroin addict. He used to see her getting beat to a pulp, after which she'd take her frustrations out on him. CPS ended up taking him and his brother away, but a few years later his mum was clean and back with their dad and they regained custody. Sort of happy ending, kind of, but not really. They lived in a small house in central Texas, and according to the user, the house had a terrifying aura. Anytime he was home, he felt like he was being watched, especially in the bathroom, and he would have regular nightmares. And at this point in his life, his mum was working herself to death because their dad was a lazy slob who did nothing. She got so depressed she tried to take her own life, and desperate to help, the user started praying to God every single day. But nothing changed. He realized for something to change, perhaps he could call on the demonic entity that engulfed his house rather than God. He researched satanic rituals for ages and finally found the one he needed. While his family were out for ice cream one day, he got on his knees, wax coming down the candles he'd lit, and cut his hand and started drawing symbols on the ground in his blood. Obviously while crying the whole time, because who wouldn't cry after doing that? He recited the words and made the deal. And right after he did that, a cold breeze swept through the house and everything went black. But he was pretty much unfazed because he expected something like that to happen, so he went to bed that night and had the worst nightmare ever. He saw himself in the reflection of the mirror in the bathroom with corpse grey skin, bloody tears, and his eyes were crimson as well. There was a noose around his neck and his hair was bloody. During the dream he thought, this can't be me, and then the reflection started laughing, saying, "It is now, you made the deal." He woke up in the bathtub covered in scratches and scars, and it just kept happening and getting worse. 1 month later he started seeing things, hearing things, his nail beds began to recede and bleed, his canines became sharper, and his tongue used to get cut out of nowhere, and he started full on hallucinating and having visions of the past, of native people being slaughtered. And how did that even happen? I don't even know. And what did he get out of all of this? Other than his mum getting a higher paying job, not much at all. So moral of the story, know what you're getting into before you ask the devil for help. Filling our number 7 slot is Joseph Smith. Now Joseph was a Mormon prophet in the early 1800s who claimed he encountered Satan before he saw Christ for the first time. We have both big shots in one story, how about that? The story goes that despite never doing this before, one day he just decided he was going to pray to God out loud. He went into the woods on a sunny day and knelt down and began to pray. I don't know why he went into the woods, he could have just done it in his house, but okay. But as soon as he did, he said he felt he was seized by a power that engulfed him entirely. He said it was so powerful he tried to speak but felt like his tongue was bound. A thick darkness surrounded him and he thought for sure he was going to die. And I mean, fair enough for being realistic. If I felt that, I'd probably think I was gonna die too. He was ready to sink into this despair that was around him, but in one final hope he used all his strength to call on God to get him out of Satan's hold. Then all of a sudden he saw a huge pillar of light over his head which came down on him. As the light rested on him, he saw 2 personages in the air above him and everything was fine again. At least this one had a happy ending, sort of. Coming in at number 5 is the Satanic Cult. This one's from Brad, who said back in 2005, him and his friends spent one summer TPing a lot of houses. In the town they grew up, there were always rumors of a satanic cult that operated around a 10-minute drive away. So one day they decided to go check it out and TP it. Ballsy move, I have to say. The 5 friends went there the day before moon, which I guess is a part of every scary story you hear nowadays, and they bypassed the fence and ended up in a garden enclosure and heard an eerie high-pitched sound. Ignoring it, they continued to explore, found an old locked church, and found nothing else and decided to leave. Bit anticlimactic, but just stay with me. When they got to their car, their key, which was working perfectly 10 minutes prior, just stopped working. The car alarm started going off and then it magically just unlocked by itself. They piled in and drove off, and mid-drive the lights in the car just went off. The driver didn't press anything to cause it, it just happened. Panicked, they rushed home, and when Brad got to his front porch, he found 3 identical black cats. Keep in mind he lives a good 25 miles away from the cult, so how did these cats even get to his house? He took the cats as a bad omen and decided to take the cats a few miles out of town and leave them there, and the whole drive he was being followed by 2 black cars despite taking small dirt roads. Now I don't know if people were just messing with him here or the satanic cult was there and they saw him and everything was their doing, but either way, it's scary and it's creepy. Now at number 2 is Steve. This one's from Redditor Shabby Boa, whose real name is Steve and who used to be a trucker for 30 years. One night after a drop off, he was on his way back home when he stopped at a diner to pee. It was completely empty, no customers, no staff, absolutely no one. He quickly peed, and when he came out, a grey-haired man was sitting at the bar. He told Steve he owned the diner and gave him food and a drink. When he got up to leave, the man said food is not what you truly desired tonight. Weirded out, Steve left and got into his truck. About an hour and a half later, he had to pee again. Steve, you've got a small bladder, mate, and saw another small diner which he stopped at. He went inside and again it was completely empty save a grey-haired man at the bar. It was the same man who said nice to have you back, Steve, as soon as he walked in. Steve got pissed at this point, thinking he was being screwed over by this guy, and demanded to know what the guy wanted. He said he was trying to help Steve. He started asking about Steve Steve and how he used to have a family. Steve told him his wife and daughter died in a house fire years ago caused by faulty wiring, but the man questioned him, saying it wasn't just faulty wiring. The faulty wiring was a happy coincidence that just so happened to have happened the same time Steve left a lit cigarette in the house. Steve fought with him more, and in the end the man offered him a deal. He said he could bring back his wife and daughter in exchange for his soul after he died. Thinking it was complete bullshit, he agreed and left the diner. Before he did, he asked the man who he was, to which he responded, "I am the devil." That night he got home as if he never stopped anywhere at all, and when he entered the house, he heard his wife say, "Steve, is that you?" and the small footsteps of his daughter. He was so excited, but when they came down the stairs, their skin was charred black. Chunks of it were falling off, their clothes had fused and melted with their skin, and Steve could barely hold in his puke. And at that point he'd realized he'd made the biggest mistake ever, and that the next 30 years were literally gonna be hell. And finally, at number 1 is The Man. This one's from VR Greg, who said she met the devil for the first time when she was 8 years old. She was walking through a forest on her way home from school when she encountered a black-haired man in a shabby suit. Except one foot of his was a goat hoof and the other was a rooster claw. She could see them when she looked at him directly, but peripherally they looked completely normal. She took him for a walk and then he left. By the time she was a teenager, she assumed the counter was maybe a dream, or maybe that she just imagined the whole thing. But one day she was watching a news story about a man who got away with killing his wife, and as they showed the judge announcing the not guilty verdict, the murderer turned around and smiled at a man behind him who wasn't his lawyer. She recognized him right away. Black hair, shabby suit, hadn't aged a day. Her parents threw her a surprise 16th birthday to which nobody came to, which is just really sad. I'm sorry that happened to you. She ran home crying, and she knew no one came because her classmate Erin had her party the same day just to spite her. That night she slept thinking about all the horrible ways Erin deserved to be punished, and the next day at the breakfast table her dad looked shaken. He told her that Erin had been found dead in the park. She met the devil the same day in her room, and he told her she had wanted it to happen and he executed it for her. He offered her a deal, but thankfully the one piece of common sense that 90% of people possess is knowing that you should never make a deal with the devil, so she didn't. The girl didn't see him again until the funeral of her mother, where he told her the doctors lied to her about her mother dying peacefully, that it was agony and that no one was around to help her. She started immediately screaming, and her dad ran over to her and made her sit down. When she asked him where the black-haired man was, he said, "You were standing alone, honey," and just started screaming out of nowhere. Shivers. That gave me shivers. Starting us off with number 10 is Padre Pio. Saint Pio of Pietrelcina was an Italian saint who had countless violent battles with the devil, many of which left him physically wounded and bleeding. One night in 1906 he heard footsteps coming towards his room, so he thought it was one of his friends, so he called out to them, but soon realized no sound was coming out of his mouth. No matter what he did, he just couldn't speak. He then saw a huge menacing black hound with smoke coming out of his mouth on a window ledge nearby. The dog then came into his room and said, "Him it is him." Is this a Yoda? Is it a hound? Who knows? And then the dog disappeared. Other encounters involved him being dragged from his bed, being thrown around his room, being spat on. One time he was even left with 3 broken ribs. And Satan would come back to him in different forms, as a black cat, as young provocative girls trying to test his chastity, as his own superiors, or worst of all, in sacred forms. Now what made him such a huge target for Satan was his work as an exorcist. It was said the second possessed people saw him, they would go ballistic, cursing him, doing God knows what, and just before leaving their body, Satan would say, "Father Pio, do not steal the bodies from us and we will not bother you." Another attack in 1964 left him with a critically injured spine and various cuts. Moral of the story, Padre Pio was a badass for surviving all of that. Coming in at number 9 is The Corner. This one's from Amy Strada, who said this happened to her when she was 14 years old. She was in her bed asleep, and mind you, her bedroom is just a simple square, and there's a door-sized space between the wall and the foot of her bed. That night she woke up at exactly 2 AM and the only light in the room was coming from her alarm clock. She was just casually looking up the ceiling, but something was looking back at her. It moved to the corner of her room and it had 4 legs that were bent backwards towards the corner of the room, whilst its torso was still facing her. Its legs gripped the ceiling and the 2 walls of the corner, and my mind is breaking even trying to imagine what angle this thing was in. And Amy couldn't see its face, just the shape of its head and its hollow eyes that were just staring at her. She knew she couldn't run because it was clearly blocking the door, so she got under the covers and didn't come out till the morning. I mean, I still use that tactic now when I think someone's in the house, and clearly it worked for her. The first time she mentioned the incident to anybody was 2 years after it happened, and her mum said that her stepdad had seen the exact same figure in his tour of Iraq. He had gone into a forest despite warnings from locals not to. Inside, he had to perform a collective exorcism on his fellow comrade who became possessed. The stepdad believed Satan came out of the soldier and started following him around. So when he came home, it was only about time before his stepdaughter Amy encountered him too. At number 8 we have the drummer. This one's from Reddit user Smoking Finger Guns, hahaha, whose grandpa told him the story. Whilst on a road trip with his granddad, he started recording a story from his youth. His granddad was divorced, but when he was younger he tried to start a band with his brother-in-law Keith. Keith was a great guitarist and the grandpa was a decent bassist. So they bought a small bit of land in rural California that had a house and a barn and turned the barn into a recording studio. They started hanging listings advertising the position of an experienced drummer, and after many trials they settled on a man named Dave. One night they were all drinking and celebrating in the barn. Keith at this point had passed out, jog on Keith, and Dave and the grandpa started talking about weird stuff, mostly occult. Dave's expression then changed drastically and he told the grandpa he was a Satanist and one of really high standing. Did that not come up during the drumming trial with Dave? Like, I feel like that should have come up. But anyway, the grandpa didn't believe Dave and asked him to prove it. Big mistake. But anyway, Dave gets up in all seriousness, holds out his arms and starts chanting in Latin like it's his first language. A few minutes later, Keith, who is passed out, stands fully erect and his eyes are white. No pupil, no iris, just white. Very freaked out, the grandpa instinctively said Jesus Christ, after which point Dave projectile vomits and then dry heaves and then looks at the grandpa with eyes that could kill. He let out a sort of dog growl of some kind and said never speak that name again in my presence, after which both Dave and Keith collapsed. While both were passed out, the grandpa went to the corner of the room just watching them and he felt a hot sensation on his shoulder like someone or some entity was grabbing him. At that point he really wasn't sure if it was Satan himself or on the opposite side his guardian angel. Filling on number 7 slot is the Horseshoe. So this one involves St. Dunstan, who was an English clergyman in the 10th century and who also claimed that he had had many encounters with Satan. St. Dunstan was a very respected man. He was pious, he was intelligent, a musician, a skilled metalsmith and an artist too. The whole package pretty much. Whilst living in Glastonbury one day, a man approached him asking him to make a metal chalice for him and Dunstan agreed and got to work, but as soon as he did, he realized the man or the thing in front of him was shape-shifting before his eyes. He went from a man to a woman and then to a child, and the transformations were so seamless it was incredibly hard to believe. Okay, the man is shape-shifting, they could be the roughest transformations ever and it'd still be hard to believe. But anyway, Dunstan realized very quickly that this was the devil and pretended not to notice the whole shape-shifting thing. When he got the chance, he grabbed a pair of red-hot tongs and pierced the man in the nostrils, which caused the man immense pain and cast the devil out. His second encounter happened while he was playing the harp. A smiley vagrant approached him this time, but St. Dunstan somehow knew it was Satan again and he grabbed him by the leg and tried shooing him like you shoe a horse. Satan screamed at a pitch so high St. Dunstan thought he was gonna pass out, but he persevered. He let Satan go on the condition that he never enter or approach a house that had a horseshoe hanging outside its doorway, and thus the whole legend of horseshoes being lucky was born. Now at number 6 is The Ritual. This one's from Redditor Graveyard Song 11, and when she was around 15 she met her friend's half-brother Luke and they became partners in crime. He was a typical goth, white makeup, red and black eyeshadow, and those two colors were pretty much the only ones he wore in terms of clothes as well. One Friday night they were bored as hell and Luke suggested summoning Satan, because what else are we to do when we're bored? Board games? Screw that! Satan it is. Either way, Luke lived opposite a cemetery, so they stopped at his house for supplies, mainly candles, milk, a bowl, salt and string. They got to the cemetery and found a clearing and gathered some twigs. Luke grabbed a stick and started drawing a weird symbol. She described it as an upside down triangle with a V under it and an X through it. He then made a circle of salt around it and put the candles around it as well. They stood inside the circle and he began talking, starting with "Oh Lucifer." He kept muttering unintelligible unintelligibly and dropped all of their ingredients into the bowl of milk. He then took her hand and cut it so it would bleed a bit, and then he cut into his own arm even deeper but directed both blood sources into the bowl. He kept chanting, and at this point the user was freaking out, saying, I believe you can summon Satan, just stop now. Luke ignored her and started speaking in a language that wasn't Latin, it was just unrecognizable. He gulped the bowl and then started vomiting violently. He got onto his hands and knees, heaving, and then asked what just happened. She said she thinks they did the ritual wrong, but Luke insisted they didn't. Things got pretty weird after that, and they kind of stopped being friends, which I'm really not surprised about. But every time she ran into Luke, he just looked like death, and her own cut wasn't healing at all, and at points it would bleed like it was just freshly done. A month later she ran into him again, and he smelled like rotting and alcohol. He apologized for what he had done to her and gave her a necklace for protection. She asked him whether he needed protection too, and he said he had done the ritual too many times that the necklace didn't work for him anymore. Nowadays she stopped wearing the necklace and her scar started bothering her again, and mind you, it's been years. It became tender and red and throbbed like it was freshly inflicted. And on top of that, the necklace encounter was the last time she ever saw Luke. He disappeared off the planet, no Facebook, no Google searches, his own mother didn't even know where he went. Safe to say, Luke's continuous summonings and encounters with Satan didn't leave him in anyone's good books. Coming in at number 5 is the Ball of Fire. So back in 1683 in Poundsgate, England, a strange figure came into the Tavistock Inn, and he was dressed in all black and wearing a cloak, but the weird thing was he had cloven hooves instead of feet, which is actually a recurring theme. If you watch part 2, you'll see that in some of those stories as well he appeared with hooves as feet as well. So hooves. Satan, it's a thing. But anyway, he asked the staff for directions to Widecombe in the Moor in Dartmouth. The staff were terrified of this man who wasn't really a man but looked evil as hell, pun intended, and gave him the directions. A few days after this visit, a huge ball of fire smashed into the church of St. Pancras, which was barely a stone's throw away from the inn. It bounced about wildly whilst killing a bunch of people and a dog. Deniers blamed it on an errant ball of lightning, which by the way I don't even think is possible, correct me if I'm wrong, but the innkeepers and those around them vehemently held the belief that it was the power of Satan. At number 4 is Satan's Fun House. This one's from Reddit user Demonic Wolf, and the story happened to him when he was 15 last June. Since his father was a computer programmer, he became very good at it as well, and hacking into the deep web was quite easy for him. One day he got onto a website called Satan's Fun House, and like anyone on the deep web, he just assumed it was just some kind of mess up porn, but before he could click off it, he got a message from a chat room he was on in another tab. The person told him to go to the site and that he wouldn't want to miss today's show. He asked the other person what show, and the person replied, also taking his username, which was weird because he had hidden his IP address, so the other person shouldn't have been able to see his username, which was demonic. The other person continued saying go to Satan's Fun House and find out. The boy was scared at this point because the guy knew his name and the fact he was on the Satan Fun House site. He felt like he was being watched, and I don't blame him. He went into the link, but it just said error 404. He went back to the chat saying the link didn't work, but the person told him he was in the right place, don't worry. Suddenly, a loud, deep, raspy voice flooded his headphones, and he was directed to another site where he saw a video. He didn't describe the video, but said the extent of mutilation he saw wasn't even the main part. He saw things that couldn't even be explained, no lighting trick, no camera trick, nothing. He was certain it was Satan at work himself. He shut the screen, packed his bags, and left, but the last thing he saw was a note that showed up on his screen with his address saying you're next. He tried to get his parents to leave with him, but obviously they just didn't believe him. He ran away from home knowing his parents were about to die and hasn't gone back since. Now at number 2 is Hawk. This one's from Shannara Johnson, who used to be a tarot reader in Sedona, Arizona. She worked at a new age center, and there were about 15 to 20 other psychic readers at the center. She was the new girl, and her room was across Cindy, a longtime reader. Cindy was middle-aged, not particularly friendly, and quite witchy. Downstairs was a binder with a picture and bio of all the readers that customers could go through and choose. There was one Native American reader, also fairly new, called Hawk, who everyone loved because he was so nice, and he was also married to another reader at the center called Amy. Hawk started warning Shannara about Cindy, saying she had no good intentions towards her and that she was jealous of her getting so many customers despite being so new. He went on to say Cindy was an actual witch and was connected to a satanic set of Tibetan monks. One day he told Shannara he had seen Cindy stare at her headshot in the binder and perform a spell over it, weird hand gestures and all. He told Shannara she had to protect herself from Cindy and sage her room more often. At one point he even offered to deal with her and said he could do something about her. Once, when the center was quite slow, she went to Hawk for a Native American spirit animal reading. During the reading, his face suddenly shifted and his features were superimposed by another glowing face. The face had a different voice inside, talking about a commitment and a deal, and that if she does it, she could have whatever she wanted. And that line, she recognized it straight away. She knew that was the devil's line. She asked him what commitment he was talking about and his face disappeared. Shannara made an excuse and left Hawk straight away and got more and more scared of being harmed. She saw divine guidance about Cindy and realized perhaps it was Hawk that was the bad guy all along, enticing her to let him harm her on her behalf. She ended up speaking to Cindy and sorting things out with her, but was damn sure Hawk was Satan himself. His wife Amy even woke up one night and his side of the bed was empty, and all she found was a black hellhound with glowing red eyes at the foot of their bed.